A man kneels in the middle of a dark, empty warehouse. Blood drips from his mouth, tracing red lines down his chin. The air is thick, heavy with betrayal and gunpowder. Standing above him is another man, his hand trembling as he grips the gun. His eyes are glassy, fighting tears he can't hold back. One escapes, rolling down his cheek, catching the dim light before it falls. His voice breaks as he whispers, "He told me to protect her, not to love her." They called him the Underboss, the right hand of power, the man who never smiled, never hesitated. A shadow that obeyed without question. Cold. Loyal. Untouchable. But every night, he disappeared, vanishing into a world no one could find. Into a silence too soft for a man of blood and violence. Whispers filled the streets. The kind of whispers that crawl under doors and through gun smoke. "He's hiding something," they said. A woman. Some thought she was a mistress. Others believed she was a weakness. But no one knew her name. No one dared to ask. Until it was too late. They met in secret, in a place where the city forgot to breathe. A dim apartment with flickering lights, where his voice softened and his hands, once used to hurt, learned to hold. She didn't belong in his world, her laughter didn't fit in the shadows, and her kindness was a crime in itself. He knew it. And yet, he kept coming back. Every night. Every stolen second. She was the only thing that made him human. The only part of him untouched by orders and blood. But love, in his world, was a dangerous thing. It didn't heal, it burned. It exposed. It made monsters hesitate. And hesitation was death. He tried to let her go once. Walked away into the night, leaving behind her tears and the warmth of her voice. But love doesn't listen to reason. It drags you back, like a ghost whispering your name in the dark. Then one day, the boss found out. Not from him. Not from her. But from the walls, because in their world, even the silence had eyes. And when the truth reached the top, everything shattered. Orders were given. Blood had to be paid for betrayal, no matter how pure the reason. That's how he ended up here, in the warehouse, staring at the man who'd been like a brother. His hand shaking. His heart breaking. He could pull the trigger and live. Or drop the gun and die. Because sometimes, love isn't a sanctuary. It's a sentence. And in the end, loyalty and love aren't so different, both demand a sacrifice. The only question is, what happens when loyalty and love pull the trigger at the same time? The first thing you should know about Luca Moretti is that he was built, not born. Not in the sense of a machine, but in the harder, quieter way the city builds men who must never look weak. Orphaned when he was a child, he learned the rules of survival before he learned how to read a book. Don Marco found him in the back room of a funeral parlor, hungry and thin, and took him in like one might take an extra coat in winter, because it was useful, because it fit. The Don didn't raise him with lullabies or lessons in kindness. He raised him with orders and with iron. "You don't feel in this world," Don Marco used to tell him, voice low and even. "You act." Luca learned to obey until obedience became the shape of him. He learned to make difficult things disappear. He learned to be the hand that ended problems quietly so the Don could keep smiling at dinners. He learned to hold his face like stone while a storm passed through the room. That is how he became the underboss, not by choice, but by being the only child left when other children disappeared or died or turned away. He became efficient. He became loyal. He became a shadow the city came to fear and depend on. The Don made him a weapon, and Luca accepted it because it meant he had a place, a name, a purpose, even if that name cost him pieces of himself. Outside the walls of Don Marco's world, the city lived on its own pulse. At night the streets throbbed with music and danger, neon bleeding into rain. During the day the same streets carried merchants and mothers and men who pretended not to know what happened after dusk. Velvet suits brushed shoulders with blood-stained hands. Power lived in handshakes and in small, polite silences. Loyalty was a currency as real as cash. Everyone knew their role, everyone paid a price. Luca walked those streets like a ruler in exile. He commanded respect without asking for it. Men stopped talking when he entered a room. Women looked away because it was safer to pretend they hadn't seen the shadow that meant trouble. The Don trusted him with secrets, with people, with the kind of violence that left holes in lives. When an enemy rose, Luca fixed it. When a business needed leaning, Luca leaned it. When the Don wanted obedience, Luca gave it, because Don Marco had given him life and orders, and he did not know how to refuse either. Still, there was a thinness to him that no one could name, not even the men who followed him. It was not weakness. It was the quiet of a man who had never been allowed to rest. Then the night came when the rules changed. It should have been ordinary, another hit arranged and carried out with the same care they treated a hot plate. But the world has a way of discarding ordinary plans. A rival had learned where Luca moved, someone had whispered wrong names into the right ears. They set an ambush in a narrow lane where brick pressed in close and where the rain would disguise sound. Luca was good. He should have seen it. He should have walked away. He did not. Maybe because he never allowed himself the luxury of doubt, maybe because he thought the life he had would always be enough to carry him through. The ambush came like a lesson he had forgotten. Bullets found the small openings, shoulder, side, a hot pain that made breath sharp and spare. He shot back, because he always did, because that is what he knew. But even a machine can be hit, even the shadow can bleed. He fled through alleys that smelled of oil and old food, hands sticky with fresh blood that matched the sunset. He moved like a ghost looking for a grave. When the streets opened again, he slid into a part of the city that felt foreign, smaller, softer. There were lights in a small studio, a single lamp, and a window full of paintings that did not fit the world he came from, bright flowers, a woman laughing in a meadow, a child holding a paper boat. He hesitated only a moment before the door opened and a woman stood there. Elena. She was not what his life required him to be interested in. She was a human who graduated from a world of paint and light, a person whose hands knew how to hold a brush and thread a needle, not how to count heads or tally debts. She looked at him as anyone would look at a stray animal that had been hurt. There was no recognition in her eyes, or if there was, she hid it with the perfect smallness of someone who had learned to keep the dangerous parts of life at arm's length. He let her pull him inside because he had nowhere else to go. She made tea with hands that trembled at the edges but did not show fear, and she laughed once at something small and ordinary as she prepared her needle. As she stitched the wound, her fingers were gentle in the way that belonged to people who healed without asking for payment. Their eyes met and for the first time in many years Luca felt the inside of his chest uncurl, like a window opening after being shut for too long. "You shouldn't be here," she told him softly, looking up from the cloth on his side. Her voice had a warmth he had nearly forgotten existed. "No one ever should," he answered, because his truth was always shaped like a broken rule. The words were not poetry, they were a fact. And yet the room between them hummed with something that was not fear. It was not love in the tidy way songs describe it. It was the quiet, dangerous thing that happens when two people meet and see the whole mess of each other and do not turn away. In the days after, Luca would learn the details of Elena's life, that she painted to keep from thinking about the emptiness her family left behind, that she taught art to children in the afternoons, that she kept her doors open to small kindnesses because the world had little use for large ones. She did not ask too many questions about where he had been. She asked only about the scar that ran along his jaw and the way his hands always stayed ready. He lied, in small, practiced ways. She accepted the small lies with a softness that frightened him more than 1,000 bullets. For Luca, every stolen moment with Elena was a gamble. He began to keep small things for himself, a found coin, a ribbon of a color she liked, a song hummed under his breath as he watched her sleep in the safety of the studio. These things did not make him less of what he had been trained to be. They made him more of what he had been denying, a man capable of feeling. But the world outside did not forget its debts. The Don had enemies who counted favors in blood. Rumors grew teeth. Someone in the Don's circle noticed Luca's absences. Someone else talked too loud in a room where silence was a weapon. From the way the city shifts at the edges, it was only a matter of time before small, private things caught fire. Luca felt the first warmth of that flame in the private places of his life. He could sense that everything practiced in the name of obedience might not be enough to stop the inevitable unraveling. The choice he had trained for, to protect the Don, to obey, to kill when ordered, suddenly pressed against a different command, a tenderness that had no orders, no clear path. In a world that taught him to act instead of feel, Luca was learning the dangerous art of holding both at once. He did not know yet which one would win. Luca kept coming back because the city taught him to be stubborn and because Elena taught him to be something softer than stubbornness, a man who could breathe. Nights that had once been a string of orders and cold routines began to fold into one another around her tiny studio, where paint smelled like rain and the windows held the glow of a life he had stopped believing in. He would stand in the doorway, coat heavy on his shoulders, and for a moment he would not think of ledgers, not of threats, not of where the next problem would come from. He would watch her move, the curve of her hand as she mixed colors, the careful way she placed a brush down like she never wanted to waste a single second of gentleness. She never asked him about the streets or the men who bowed when he walked by. She asked only about the scar near his eyebrow, about a childhood memory he pretended to have, about what song he would hum if he let himself hum one. He lied when he had to. He told her stories that made him sound like a traveler rather than the man who made other men vanish. He kept his gun hidden behind a loose floorboard before he dressed the wound on his palm, because he could not bear the thought that the thing that kept him alive could also be the thing that broke the peace he had found there. Elena painted him once, in a single afternoon that felt like forgiveness. She painted his hands, enormous and careful, as if hands could hold more than harm. She painted his eyes with a softness he did not know he had. When she finished, she stood back, the canvas trembling in her palms like someone holding a secret too large to keep. She tore it in half before he could speak, not in anger but in fear, as though showing him the whole truth might hand his life to the wrong people. He watched her do it, helpless in a way no battlefield had ever managed to make him. He wanted to tell her that the torn painting was more beautiful than any whole picture, that the rawness suited him better than pretending, but he only swallowed the words and let the silence do the work. Love in Luca's life did not arrive with fireworks and bright declarations. It pooled like quiet water in a cave, slow, steady, essential. He learned to measure time by how many nights he could spend inside that small apartment before the city called him back. He learned to keep two faces, one for the studio, one for the Don. The face for the Don wore flat lines and a watchful calm. The face for Elena smiled without proof. He believed he could live with both. He believed until evidence proved otherwise. Don Marco began to notice the small, dangerous things. A postponed meeting here, an order delayed there, a subtle tremor in the way Luca looked at a man who had once been a problem. The Don did not ask directly. He did not need to. The family moved like a living thing, it could feel when a part stopped performing. Rumors spread along the same routes as loyalty, whispered in offices, muttered over brandy, carried in the pockets of men who thought they were invisible. Someone in the Don's network saw Luca slip away one night and thought it odd that the underboss should walk alone. Someone else saw the way his jaw softened when he returned and wondered if the steel had been compromised. In their world, anything softer than obedience was a wound that could infect the whole. Elena's secret lived in the same small space where Luca had learned to hide little things, under the loose floorboard, behind a painting, in the way she avoided names. She was Don Marco's younger sister, a detail that could have been a poem if it did not smell of coffins. She had been sent away years before when the family decided she was better kept out of sight, a niece, they said, or a cousin, a convenient story that fit around their appetite for control. She had been raised away from the violence that made men like Luca and the Don what they were, taught to find comfort in light and color instead of commands. Elena had kept her true name folded into a life of ordinary things because to reveal it would be to put both of them in a ledger the Don kept with care. When Luca first learned the truth, it arrived like a paper cut, sharp, sudden, and full of danger. He did not hear it from Elena. She had never intended to confess the family line she bore, she had only wanted to be known as Elena, the woman who taught children to paint, not as a name that meant power and blame. He found out the way men like him always found out, through a mistake, through a loose tongue, through a night when the wrong person sat in the wrong bar and listened to the wrong laughter. The knowledge fell on him and layered itself over every decision he had made in the months she had been his peace. He felt it in his bones, that the Dawn would not tolerate it, that blood owed blood in their business, that a sister in the wrong place could become a debt. The moral crossroads arrived like a silence before a storm. Luca stood with one foot in two worlds and felt them tug in opposite directions. The Dawn's code was simple and cruel: loyalty, first, last, always. It had been his compass for so long he no longer knew how to do without it. Elena's plea was simple too, but its mercy felt like a threat to the life he had built. "Run with me," she said one night, voice low and urgent, hands gripping his as though her fingers could anchor him. "Leave it. Take me away from this." He thought of the Dawn's face, of the plate at formal dinners that tipped with his silence, of the men who owed their lives to his obedience. He thought of the children who would be left with no protector if the family collapsed into a war of retribution. He thought of the faces of men he had killed on orders, and whether dying for love would lessen the weight of what he had done. "If the Dawn ever finds out," Luca answered, and the truth in his voice sounded like an apology, "we both die." Her reply was a kind of prayer and a dare wrapped into one: "Then let us die free." The words made a map of possibilities he had never allowed himself to travel. He dreamed of both paths and found they were impossible to hold at once. In one dream he took Elena away to a place where people did not count favors in blood, where they could sit in a kitchen with sunlight and not expect gunfire at midnight. In another, he stayed, shoulder to the wheel of the Dawn's empire, steady and useful until usefulness demanded a sacrifice he could not refuse. Every choice nudged the trap closed a little tighter. When he delayed a hit to be with her, the Dawn's inner circle tightened like a hand. When he answered a call from the Dawn in the middle of the night, Elena's eyes filled with fear that he hid behind a smile. The more he tried to live in both places, the more obvious his cracks became. Men who once respected him began to whisper that the underboss had been softened, that he might be bought, that his loyalty had cracks big enough to see through. Loyalty in their world did not forgive softness, it exploited it. Love did not offer immunity either, it exposed him. Luca felt the doom in small ways: a glance held too long by someone who wanted to test him, a meeting rescheduled without explanation, a rumor handed like a coin to an eager mouth. Every decision deepened the doom because every decision left a footprint someone could follow. He moved through days like a man carrying two weights and feeling each threaten to pull him under. The city waited, patient as a blade. The night the truth detonated, the city felt like it had been holding its breath for years. Luca had grown used to shadows, he moved through them like someone who belonged there. So when a man in a cheap overcoat followed him from the studio, Luca thought it was probability, not design. People watched people all the time in his world. That's how power stayed tidy. But this time the watching had an edge, a patience that smelled like a trap. The spy kept his distance, slipping through alleys with the same quiet purpose Luca used to slip through life. He watched Luca enter the studio, he watched Luca leave. He listened to all the small things Luca never thought would become evidence: the laughter at the window, the way Luca's coat fell open, the smell of tea that did not belong in a life of business. That night the spy made a phone call that moved like lightning through the Dawn's network. Words flew along the same wires Luca once believed only carried orders. There was no drama in the call. No raised voice. Just the steady voice of someone who had seen a pattern and decided to follow it to its end. "He's been disappearing," the spy said. "The underboss goes to a woman. She lives in paint and light." Don Marco's voice answered, low and slow. The voice Luca had learned to read like a ledger. "Bring me everything," the Don said. "Bring me the truth." The truth arrived folded in the old way power used to speak, quietly, finally, with a patience that made the world colder. Luca heard the call himself, the boss on the other end of his own phone, and it was like a hand closing around the last of his air. "You've been lying to me, my brother," Don Marco said. There was no surprise in the way he said it, and that made it worse. "And worse, you've been lying with my sister." That single sentence was an engine that stripped the room bare. It took from Luca the little private room he had been allowed to build. It took the soft truth he had been keeping like contraband. It turned every stolen hour into a ledger of treason. He walked cold with it through his bones. The Don did not need to ask where Elena had come from. He knew. He always had his ways. The spy had done what the spy was paid for. He had catalogued, confirmed, reported. And the Don, who had always been careful to fold family into power, decided to fold this small betrayal into punishment. After the call, Luca felt different, as if the city had taken a photograph of him and developed it in front of his face. He moved with the weight of something that must be answered. He tried to taste the air for mercy and found only calculation. But the worst part was what he learned in the days after. Elena had known. She had known who he was from the first night he collapsed into her studio, because in this family, names don't stay hidden forever. She had not been surprised by the uniforms or the danger. She had not been naive. Instead, the truth had been a slow thing in her eyes, folded like paper. Luca had imagined her as an accidental saint in his life, someone untouched by the ledger of debts and favors. He had been wrong. The revelation struck him like a mirror shattering. She wasn't only a refuge. Somehow, she had also been a reckoning. Once he learned that Elena had always known, questions multiplied like rats in an old cellar. Had she loved him anyway? Had she kept him close on purpose, to punish him for being what he was? Or had she been trapped in a corner of her own making, holding on to him because she could not face the dawn if she let go? The answers were ugly and human. They were not neat. She had told him things, small things, tender things, that meant she had stood with him. She had waited for him, mended his wounds, and shared bread with him. Those moments were true. But truth is not a single color in this life. It can be used as a blade. The Don's decision came not as thunder but as a quiet, surgical thing. He called for a meeting in a room that smelled like old wood and fresh money. Luca walked there without his gun. He left it at the door like a confession. The men who surrounded the table were the geometry of the family, angles and balances, loyalty measured in degrees. Elena was there too, sitting in a chair that looked too small for the room. She did not flinch. She did not beg. She folded her hands like someone who had practiced composure the way a soldier practices aim. When Luca stepped forward, the room narrowed to a throat. He could have brought a weapon. He could have walked in with a gun and changed the physics of the whole morning. But some things cannot be fixed with a bullet. He believed, maybe too late, that if he entered armed he would become what they expected, another man who killed to save himself. He did not want Elena to see that. "If you're going to kill me," he said, his voice a low thing that trembled only at the edges, "do it where she can't see." The sentence surprised the table into silence. It surprised him too. Saying it felt like a prayer and like an admission. He would not let his love be erased in public. He could not bear the thought of her watching him die for something that had, at its center, been a tender mistake. The Don looked at him the way a man studies a ledger with an error, not angry so much as disappointed, and disappointment can be worse than rage in a family that trades in absolutes. "Love can be a lie," Don Marco said quietly, like a man reciting a lesson. "Or it can be a betrayal dressed in beautiful things." His words landed on Luca like heavy coins. Elena did not speak right away. When she did, her voice was small but steady. "I did not plan this," she said. "I did not go to him to punish him. I came because he was hurt." Her eyes found Luca's, and in them he saw a map of choices she had made, and the places she had allowed herself to be soft. Luca wanted to hate her for the secret, for the deception that had the shape of punishment. He also wanted to hold her and never let the family or the city put their hands on her again. The moral ruin of it was that both instincts were true at once. The Don's sentence was not a single blade, it was a slow unbraiding of lives. He spoke of loyalty and of the harm done by betrayal. He spoke of family as a thing greater than the sum of its members, a vessel that must remain pure even if it cost an innocent heart. Luca listened as if the words were rain hitting metal, loud, inevitable, cold. In private, he imagined his options laid out like cards. He could fight, and leave a trail of blood that would soak Elena's name into everything the family touched. He could run, and take her with him into the kind of freedom that comes with no guarantees, where danger becomes a shadow that follows but does not command. Or he could accept the death sentence the Don had always kept in his pocket like a spare coin. None of the options felt like salvation. The new question the night left behind was a question that took Luca until the very end to answer. Is love still pure when it destroys the only thing you swore to protect? He did not have an answer that fit neatly into a prayer or a threat. He had only the feeling of his heart being a small, fragile object passed from hand to hand in a room where men had kept their hands steady for years. The truth had unraveled everything. Love and betrayal were braided into a single rope, and now they would be used to hang or to free. The city waited to see which. The warehouse was quiet, except for the sound of dripping water and the low hum of distant traffic. It was the same place where Luca had once proven his loyalty, where he had first earned the title of Underboss. Now, it was the place where everything he had built was about to burn down. The cement floor smelled of oil and rain, and in that damp, echoing space, a single light hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly, its glow trembling over the ghosts of old sins. Luca knelt on the cold ground. His hands were tied, his face was bruised, and his coat hung open to reveal the bloodstain on his shoulder, a reminder of how close he had already come to death. Across from him stood Don Marco. The man who had made him. The man who had turned a boy with nothing into a weapon that could command fear with a glance. But tonight, Don Marco's eyes weren't the eyes of a mentor or a father. They were the eyes of judgment. Of betrayal. Of a god watching his favorite angel fall. 2 guards flanked Luca, guns drawn. Don Marco's voice echoed through the warehouse, low and sharp as broken glass. You were my brother, Luca. My right hand. You gave me loyalty, and I gave you everything. But this. He gestured toward the blood on Luca's shirt, the silence, the trembling breath between them. This is how you repay me. Luca lifted his head slowly. His voice was steady, though his heart felt like it was breaking itself apart. You told me once that love was weakness, he said. You were wrong. Love was the only thing that made me human again. Don Marco's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his expensive shoes cutting through the puddles on the floor. She's my blood, he hissed. You defiled that. You destroyed the only rule that mattered. Luca closed his eyes. I didn't destroy anything. I found something worth dying for. That sentence, quiet as it was, cracked the air. One of the guards flinched. Even Don Marco hesitated, just long enough for the wind outside to push against the warehouse doors. Then the doors burst open. Elena. Luca's voice broke. She ran inside, her dress soaked from the rain, her hands trembling as she stumbled into the light. Her face was pale, her hair clinging to her skin, and her eyes, those eyes that had once looked at him with gentleness, were wild with terror. Stop, she screamed. Her voice echoed like a shot. Don't do this, please. The guards froze. Don Marco turned, startled for the first time. Elena, he said, her name carrying both rage and heartbreak. You shouldn't be here. She stepped closer, her tears cutting through the dirt on her cheeks. You shouldn't be doing this, she said, voice shaking but loud enough to fill the warehouse. You think killing him will make you strong again. You think power means love. Don Marco's hand trembled on the gun. He betrayed me for you. And you betrayed us both when you forgot what love means, she cried. The warehouse fell silent. Even the dripping stopped. For a moment, Don Marco looked almost human, the cracks in his armor showing, the weight of every sin pressing against him. Then, with a movement that was more reflex than choice, he raised the gun and fired. The shot tore through Luca's shoulder, throwing him backward onto the floor. The sound bounced off the walls, deafening and final. Elena screamed. She ran toward him, dropping to her knees beside his bleeding body. Her hands were slick with his blood, her sobs catching in her throat. "Luca, stay with me," she cried. Don Marco took a step forward, gun still in hand, his expression twisted between fury and sorrow. "You don't understand, Elena," he said. "He was poison. He would have destroyed you, like he destroyed everything else." She looked up at him then, her eyes wet, her voice trembling. "No," she whispered. "You did that." The guards hesitated. Something shifted in the air, a silence that didn't belong to this world. Elena reached for Luca's gun. Her hands shook violently, fingers slipping over the metal slick with rain and blood. She lifted it, her aim unsteady. "Put it down," Don Marco warned, his tone turning gentle now, as though speaking to a frightened child. "You don't know what you're doing." "Yes," she said, the word breaking through her tears. "I do." Her finger tightened on the trigger. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Then the shot rang out. The bullet hit Don Marco in the chest. He stumbled backward, surprise flooding his face, not pain, but disbelief, as if the world itself had betrayed him. His gun slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. The echo of the shot lingered long after he fell. Silence swallowed the warehouse whole. The guards didn't move. One turned his face away. The other lowered his weapon, as if the act itself had emptied the world of purpose. Elena dropped the gun. Her hands were shaking, her body trembling as if the weight of what she'd done was too much for her bones to hold. Luca crawled to her, his wounded arm dragging behind him. He reached her side and pulled her close, their bodies folding together on the wet concrete. Between them, Don Marco lay still, the man who had created them both, now dead by the hand of love itself. Elena's breath came in broken sobs. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I just wanted him to stop." Luca pressed his forehead against hers. His voice was low, raw, full of something too heavy to name. "Now you've become what I was." She pulled back, her eyes red, searching his face for an answer. "No," she said, barely more than a whisper. "I became what you made me love." And that was the truest thing either of them had ever said. Around them, the city breathed again. The rain outside picked up, tapping against the warehouse roof like the world's slowest applause. The guards disappeared into the shadows, unwilling to carry this story back to the streets. Elena sat there, holding Luca, blood from both of them mixing into one stain on the floor. Somewhere above, dawn was beginning to break, pale, uncertain, but real. Luca looked up at the thin light creeping through the cracks in the roof. He thought of what the dawn had said about love being weakness, and he finally understood. Love was weakness only to men who feared its strength. To everyone else, it was the only thing left worth dying for. He felt Elena's hand in his, trembling but warm. Together, they watched the last breath leave Don Marco's body, and with it, the world they had once belonged to. Outside, the sirens began to wail, faint, distant, inevitable. But for the first time in years, Luca didn't feel afraid. He looked at Elena, her face streaked with tears and rain, and saw not tragedy, but truth. Love had destroyed them. But in a world built on blood and loyalty, it had also been their only salvation. And as the light grew stronger, washing over the bodies and the ruin, the narrator's voice fell soft and final. In the end, love didn't save them from the world. It just made their destruction mean something. They cleaned the warehouse in the morning the way people sweep up the evidence of a storm, quickly, politely, as if the city could pretend it had not happened. Men with slicked hair and clean shoes moved through the puddles, folding the scene into a quiet file the way the dawn had once folded favors into silence. For a while, nothing moved, then the rumor mill started its slow, hungry work. By noon there were 3 versions of the night, and by dusk there were a dozen. Stories grow teeth the way lies do, sharp, useful, and endlessly hungry. Some said Luca bled out on the concrete, his life slipping away while Elena held him and whispered apologies he could not hear. That told them what they wanted, that justice, or fate, or the dawn's law had taken him back, neat and final. Others said something softer and crueler, that he carried Elena into the rain and fled, that he wrapped her in a coat, dug a grave in the hills outside the city, and buried her with the tenderness he'd refused to let himself show before. That version made him into a ghost who could love and be kind, and people liked thinking he might have found a single, private mercy. A few claimed he left the city entirely, that he walked down to the docks and boarded a rusting freighter with a new name tattooed into his bones. Those people liked the idea that even men made of violence might find a way to unmake themselves. The underworld took a different pleasure in language. To them, Luca's disappearance became a lesson and a warning. In alleys and over brandy, his name was said like a cautionary tale: don't let a soft thing in, because soft things will break your machine. But whispers change tone if they travel through the right mouths. Some of the same men who taught fear also taught reverence. He loved her, they would say, and their voices softened. He loved the Don's sister. That was the kind of line that became legend because it carried both shame and awe. It made the underboss human in a way the city could not afford. Time thinned the edges of the night until it looked like a story and not a crime. The empty chair in the studio gathered dust. Paintings leaned against the wall, their colors fading but their meaning unchanged. Elena's brushes dried with salt-stiff bristles. The studio smelled like tea and rain for weeks, then like paint and memory for years. Neighbors told reporters they remembered the sound of her laughter, or the way she fed pigeons, or the way she taught children to mix colors like they were mixing futures. Not a single reporter could know whether those memories belonged to the woman who had been Don Marco's sister, or to the myth the city wanted to hold. The Don's death made the family bleed in ways paper could not show. Men who had answered to his voice now tried to answer to a ledger he had left behind. Power is a map with many hands on it, and maps get redrawn when a compass dies. In those redrawn lines, Luca's name became a landmark, a place on the map where loyalty once bent and broke and where something like love dared to grow. Some of the old men pretended it had nothing to do with them, others rewired their loyalties quickly, as men do when a god falls. They asked questions in the right rooms and received answers in silence. The Don's funeral was the kind of event that taught you how much weight a man once carried by how many people refused to cry for him. The eulogies were certain and flat, the speeches heavy with gratitude and empty of softness. Those who had feared him said they had loved him, those who had loved him stayed away. It was the kind of hypocrisy the city understood and accepted. No one asked about Elena in the formal notes. She was a private footnote in a public ledger. But people remembered the way her name fit into the old stories, the way her life had folded into Luca's like a page into another book. Weeks bled into months. The city's appetite for drama moved on to new tragedies and new celebrations, but some stories stick in the teeth of the streets. Luca's name did. Mothers would tell restless children a softened version of his tale to explain why they should keep their promises and why some sacrifices go unpaid. Old men would mutter the version that ended with death like a poem about the uselessness of softness in a hard world. Occasionally, on rainy nights, someone would swear they saw a figure on the far end of the bridge, a broad-shouldered man with a limp and a coat too thin for winter, walking away from the city as if leaving a life were as simple as turning one's back. Those were the stories the hopeful told themselves. They needed endings that showed cunning and mercy in equal measure. The truth, if truth can exist in a place that trades in rumor, was never simple. There were nights when the narrator walked the streets and listened to conversations meant for air, and sometimes the quiet truth is the only kind that survives. Luca left, or he died, or he hid, or he made a grave for the woman he loved. Each of those truths is a different kind of sorrow. Each one asks you to choose what you need to believe. Elena's name remained folded in the mouths of those who remembered kindness. Her portrait, a torn canvas that was never whole again, lived in the memory of an old painter who claimed, in his cups, to have seen the other half of the painting in a dream. People liked that. Dreams are easier to keep than bodies. In bars, men raised a glass to Luca in different ways. To some he was a fool who had traded survival for a soft something that would eat him. To others he was a saint who finally found the courage to love a little and die a little for it. Both were comforts and both were lies. What remained unsaid between the two of them was the thing legends often forget, the small details that make a person real. How Luca would hum under his breath when he was nervous. How Elena washed paint from her hands and kept the smell on her skin like a secret charm. How they argued softly about nothing and made it into something. How they made a life in the margins for a few fierce, dangerous months. How Luca's last words, or the words that people said were his last, held more truth in their softness than any confession in a courtroom. The city moves on, that is what cities do. But stories, once sown, grow roots in the cracks. In the underworld, there is now a story someone always tells when the night grows too long and men feel too brave. It is told with the one line that never goes out of style: he loved the boss's sister. It sits between confession and scorn, and that is where legends live best, in the place where you cannot say for certain what is true. He kept two secrets, her name, and his death sentence. And in the end, no one ever found either. If this story made you question whether love can survive betrayal, share your thoughts below. What would you have done in Luca's place? Would you have chosen loyalty, or love? Subscribe to CineVerse for more stories where power and passion collide. Where loyalty bleeds into love. And love becomes the crime no one survives.